Hello everyone, my name is Jennifer Ferro, and I will be speaking to you today about applications and interviews. I recently read an article conducted by K-State researchers at the K-State University. This study was conducted for 600 employees in the food service industry, managers, and all different types of food service industry, and restaurants and managers and employees as well. The first study they did was, instead of a focus group, they have a researcher who comes to the restaurant and observes. I learned this research is called ethnography. This is where the researcher integrates into the community over a period of time. The first project they did was in a commercial restaurant. They observed the employees' food service practices. They did 20-minute observations in 10-minute rest periods over 3 hours with all different shifts. They did a breakfast shift, a lunch shift, and the dinner shift. In total, they did 6 observations with 4 employees at a time. 242 employees participated and 33 different food service operations. There was a study done also on hand washing procedures and how do they practice the correct hand washing procedures in different delis. They did over 4 different delis and 16 different venues. 4 sections of the retail operation were childcare, restaurants, schools, and the elderly homes. The other project they did was that they interviewed 4 different managers on 4 different levels in different restaurants and operations, and they did focus groups as well. The challenges they faced in interviewing employees of the food service industry was what interview forms to have on site, because every situation is different, so they had to come prepared, and how to adapt with their research and the different protocols they had to follow. They also have to have an approval process done by the RIB. The 2 questions the RIB asked of the food service researchers were, what would you do if you saw an employee intentionally put something into the food, and how would you assure that a supervisor would not find out about an employee's performance? Because this was done to research different food service groups and industries and restaurants to see how they did safety practices, not for a supervisor to find out how their employee is doing. Another challenge they faced was getting participants and retaining participants. This study was done over a 3-year period, and during this time, they lost over 86% of their participants, which actually left them with 33 participants in total. The way they collected their data was they did observations while going into the restaurant and writing their observations on a spiral notebook. This made many people nervous. Something that the researchers had to learn to do was adapt to the climate. By this means that they had to go into the industry and sit down and observe someone, but if the person asked them to taste their food, then they would have to taste their food. What I learned from this project was that you have to be very careful when you are a business and you are asking questions for interviews and when you are having a candidate fill out applications. Because on the application and during the interview, you cannot ask the person's sex, their age, their race, their culture. It's called discrimination, and it can be liable. So you have to be incredibly careful on what you ask specifically. And it said that this particular K-State had to go through many loops to get approval by the IRB, which means that it took them 3 to 6 months to get this approval. And there was a ton of applications and a huge process by making sure that they had documentation, and they had to have all different types of documents, and they had to be very precise, and it took 3 to 6 months. What I learned in the take-home message from this, again, is that you have to be incredibly careful When you are hiring, when you're interviewing, when you're filling out an application, when you're sending an application to a candidate, not just in the food industry, but everywhere, because you could have a lawsuit against you. And again, this research was done by K-State, and it was a very interesting article to read. It was 22 pages, and it just showed you about how people, how researchers, really what the steps of a researcher has to go through in order to get acceptance of the IRB, and what they had to go through and how they researched. Now, the way they did different research, was not only did they ask questions, not only did they go into the restaurants and observe, but they had focus groups. They had a focus group specifically with 5 different managers of different venues like child care, a nursing home for the elderly, schools, and one particular restaurant. And they sat down and they spoke to the managers, and they asked them about their food service safety procedures. So this was a very big eye-opener to see how a university would do a study about the food service industry, and really what the food service industry details, and how, when you're a candidate, what goes into interviewing and what goes into filling out forms and getting the application process to hire a candidate, and what you can say and what you can't say to avoid a lawsuit. So specifically what I learned is that you have to be incredibly careful on when you're having a candidate, when you're interviewing a candidate, you have to be very specific on what you ask and what you're allowed to ask by law. And that's what I learned. Hope you like my YouTube presentation. Have a great day.